Alright, hello and welcome to my first ever tutorial video. Today we'll be working on creating a cube rolling mechanic. If you ever heard of games like Last Cube or Cube Quest, this basic concept is that you have a cube that you get to play as your player character and you roll around as a cube. So we're going to create exactly that. I've just created a basic test level here that we're going to be using. And yeah, let's get started. So I'm going to go to content browser. I have just a folder for the tutorial, and within it, maps. I'm going to create another folder for the player. Oh. And inside of the player, we're going to create two blueprints. One is going to be the pawn. So BP player pawn. We're actually even going to call it BP cube player. There you go. And we're going to create a player controller. So BPC cube and controller. Oh, is there a space? Oh, let's see. White space is. Cube controller. Perfect. Fix this is we're going to go back to our tutorial here. What we're going to do is create a game mode for us. That way we can set our own player controller and player pawn. We're going to call this game mode cube. And in here, we're just going to go to the class defaults, go to our player controller, select our BPC cube controller. Our default pawn will be BPQ player. And the world settings, game mode, and click our new made game mode there. We're going to go ahead and open up the cube player. Going to add a few components here. One is going to be the skeletal mesh, which Unreal should already have a skeletal cube, which we're just going to use here. I'm going to actually scale mine down a little bit, 5.5. Actually, no, maybe not. No, we'll just keep it. Skeletal mesh, cube. Perfect. All right. Camera is a little quick, so I'm going to zoom it down a little bit. All right, perfect. We have our skeletal mesh. Now we're going to add a spring arm for the camera because I want it to be kind of like a top or third person perspective. And the spring arm is not going to be attached to the skeletal mesh, so I'm going to detach it by dragging it onto the skeletal mesh to detach it. Gonna add, with the spring arm selected, gonna add a camera, just a regular camera. And the last thing we're gonna need is a scene. Oops. A scene point, scene component, which is gonna act as our pivot point for rotating the cube. So we're just gonna add one of those, call it pivot point. And I'm going to detach it from the spring arm. Oops, like that. So now it's we got 3 separate components within the spring arm. There's the camera, so 4 in total. And we're gonna go start with the spring arm. So in the details panel, one thing, gonna zoom out here. Gonna set the target arm length to 482, and you can set this to whatever you like. It's just something that I kind of found I liked when I set it up. The target offset is going to be 130 in the X and 530 in the Z. So you got something like that. And take the camera itself and rotate it down a little bit so it's pointed. Actually, just a little bit more. Boom. That should do it. Yeah, so it's looking straight down. Gonna go back to the spring arm now and uncheck the inherit pitch, yaw, and roll. And that should do it for the spring arm. Let's see. Gonna go and put this in the world. So actually, take the cube and set it in the world. Now press play, and there's our cube. It's a little tiny. I'm gonna make it a little bigger so it fits the shape of the one tile grid size. Go back to the cube player. Select cube, undo that, and we're just gonna scale this up maybe by 5. Let's see. A little big, so probably 4. Let's see. Yep, that should do it. Cool. But before that, I'm going to kind of quickly explain what's happening with, or what we're going to do with the pivot point. So I'm going to take this pivot point here, and I'm going to first of all reset its location. It's all the way over here to 0. So it's going to be right in the center, bottom center of our cube, right there. And the idea here is that we're going to move this pivot point, about 50 spaces, 50 units in each one of these directions to create a pivot for the rotation of the cube. So if I, just kind of as a quick example here, so if I take the skeleton mesh and attach it to the pivot point, and then I rotate the pivot point, we can see that the cube is doing what we want it to do, which is rolling around from face to face. So I'm gonna undo that, actually just Control Z, and reset. Oops. Reset the location, everything. And that's that. So that's kind of basically how it's going to work. And we're going to go do that in code. Now for that to happen, we need a few variables. I'm going to expand this here and go to variables. First one we're going to make is a Boolean. I'm going to call it up or, oops, or down. Question mark. Next one is going to be a float value for the amount that we're going to change the rotation of a certain axis of the pivot point for either up or down or left or right. So we're going to call this the pivot point pivot rotation modifier. So pivot, oh, where am I? Float. Pivot rotation modifier. Perfect. The last variable we're going to create is a rotation for holding the pivot's world rotation. So go here, go to rotator, call this pivot rotation. Perfect. Now we're going to go to our begin play here, and the first thing we're going to do is set our actor rotation to 90 on the Z. That way we're facing the correct direction when we're doing the movements from left to right or up or down. Now we're going to jump over to our player controller and set up a few things there. Going over to our player controller, the event graph. Oh, actually, let me go back a step. Go to our cube player again. We're going to search for, or actually it's right here. So AI controller class. We're going to select our controller that we VPC cube controller and compile save. Now we can go back to our cube controller, and usually you'd want to set up like input mapping contacts, but for just quickly testing this and make sure it's working, we're going to just use the debug key, so WASD. So search for, right click and search for W key right there. And we're going to start with just the up direction for now, and we'll get into the other good stuff later. Then we got our up or down right there. Now the very first thing we want to do is take this pivot and move it 50 units in a certain direction. So we're going to go to our event graph. We're going to go to our blueprint, create a function, and call it set pivot location. And it's going to take a input of a vector. I'm going to call this the position mod for modifier. And we're going to do something pretty simple here. I'm going to go to our pivot point, get its relative location, and add this position modifier to it, and then set its relative location to this new value here. Just like that. Clean that up, and clean that up. Cool. Now to kind of see this in action, we're going to go to our VPC controller here. And first thing we want to actually do is get a reference to our player character. Now, usually you want to set up like a blueprint interface to get the player reference and store it there, and then get it from something like, get player pawn, and then call your interface message to get the control of the player. But we're gonna just quickly just cast one time to our cube controller, or cube player, my bad. Right here, cube player, and store it as a variable. So we have reference to it at begin play. Just like that. Now, I'm gonna go to our up key here, and we're gonna get our player character and call set pivot location. And for the position modifier, we're going to change here. It's going to be the y-axis. We go here to our viewport of our player. So we're going to move in the y-axis to this point right here. And we're going to do that by -50 there. Now compile. Press W, and then press F8 to exit. If I go to my outliner, select on my cube player, and the details, go to the pivot. We can see even here it says -50. We go look in the forward direction, which is that way. We can see that it has changed to that spot where we want it to be. Great, perfect. We can exit, and we know that functionality is working. Right. The next thing that we're going to be working on is attaching the pivot to the player's cube. So, I'm going to go back to the player here. Actually, I'm going to close this game mode since we don't need it. I usually do save on compile and success only, so I don't need to do both. And we're going to go back to our cube player, go to the event graph, and we're going to make a new function called detach. Oops, I have to select detach pivot. Or sorry, attach pivot. My bad. Attach. We're going to do detaching later. Attach pivot. And this one's going to be super simple. Just take the pivot, take the skeletal mesh, and we're going to do an attach component to component. Right there. The parent is going to be the pivot point. The target is going to be the skeletal mesh. And we're going to change the location, rotation, and scale to all keep world. Beautiful. Go compile and save. Now if we go back to our PPC Cube controller, we're going to duplicate this just for cleanliness sake and call our attach pivot. Great. I'm going to do that, compile and save, and go look at it in the level. So I'm going to press play, press W, and then F8. Go to the outliner, click our cube, in the details, we can see that the pivot here has a little drop down because the skeletal mesh has now been attached to it. So if we click on the pivot, I go down here. If I click to rotate, there, and we can see that by manually rotating it, it will do what we want it to do, which is forward cube movement, face to face. Perfect, we can exit out, we know that works. Next thing we're going to do is create another function for resetting the pivot's rotation. Since every time we move in a certain direction, we want it not to affect or continuously affect the rotation of the pivot. We want to reset it back to a certain rotation value so it can work properly every single time for every movement input. So we're going to go to our blueprint and create a new function called reset pivot. Let's go here. Reset pivot, or if you want, you could be even more specific. Reset pivot world rotation. And we're going to do exactly that, which is take this pivot, set its world rotation to 90 degrees on the Z. Perfect. And that's it for that. Go back to our cube controller, and we're just going to put that reset pivot world rotation right there. Compile and save. Now that we have the basic setup of getting our cube's pivot, location, and attachment, we're going to start working on the actual rotation. So, going to our cube layer event graph, we're going to create a custom event for rotating the cube. So, custom event, and we're going to call it rotate cube. For rotate cube, we're going to need a couple inputs, specifically the up or down and a boolean and the pivot rotation modifier. So we're going to go click on this, details, add one input, boolean for up or down. And another variable for a float value for the pivot rot mod. And in this event, we're basically going to be using a timeline to rotate the cube, rotate the pivot point's rotation based on that timeline. So first thing we're going to want to do is, but also we're going to rotate it in certain axes based on this up or down value. So we want to take this and set it to the input there. I'm going to take our pivot rotation modifier and set it to the input here. And last but not least, we're going to take our pivot point, get its world rotation, because we want a reference to its rotation at a certain point in time while we do the timeline animation or mock animation, so that it's not checking its world rotation every single second. It has a reference to it at a certain instance and rotates it based off of that. So we're going to take our pivot rotation and set it to that. Beautiful. Perfect. Move that in a little bit. Nice and cozy. Now we get to the juicy stuff. We're going to add a timeline. Call it cube anim. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it cube anim for animation. Open it up. Add a track. Add a float track. Name that track alpha, because that's what it's going to be. It's going to be the alpha for the lerp we're going to be doing. So very simple. We're going to be right click, add a key, right click, add a key, take the first key, or first of all, we're going to change the length of this timeline. It's a little long, 5 seconds. And you can change this based on however you like, but I'm going to go with 0.5, so half a second. Press this zoom to fit horizontal, zoom to fit vertical, to fit both of these points in the screen. Go to their first point. Going to go to a time of 0, value of 0. There it is. And take our second point, time of 0.5, value of 1. We're going to go from 0 to 1, lerp, because the lerp takes a 0 to 1 value, so that's what we're going to do here. We're going to have our first point selected, second point, so shift and drag, left click, hold and drag to select the second point. Right click and select auto, so it does a nice little curve here. Looks smoother. File save, go back to our bent graph, and we're going to plug this in to play from start. Every time we want it to play from the start, from 0 to 1. Now we have our little alpha here, and we're going to do 2 different things on the update based on our up or down boolean. So we're going to grab our boolean and do a branch. Update branch. Now, if it's up or down, if we want to go up or down, we want to rotate it on a certain axis. So we're going to create 2 functions, or similar to each other, but small differences. So the first function we're going to make is rotate up or down. Rotate up, up, can't spell right now, or down. Perfect. This is going to take a single input of a float, which is going to be our alpha. Perfect. Now, we're going to do something very simple here. We're just going to rotate our pivot point here, set its world rotation, and we're going to lerp between 2 different values for our rotation. So we're going to drag from here, select a lerp rotator, and for our first A value, we're going to take our pivot rotation we got earlier, because it's the start of our rotation we want to start from, and then the end where we want to go to. So we're going to right click and split, so we can get each roll, pitch, and yaw value here. Select this and duplicate it, and then split it as well. And very simply, we're going to add to our X value here by the pivot rotation modifier. So we're going to grab our pivot rotation modifier, drag this out, and we want to do an add, and just put the bottom there, top there, and put that into there, and drag the rest into here. In our alpha, if you could drag like this. I like to do something different, where right click, if you just search for the input alpha, if you go all the way down to the very bottom, you'll always get the function that you're in, any variables that correspond to that function at the very bottom. So I'm going to get alpha and drag that in there. All right. Nope. And last thing, connect these 2, just like that. Now all we're going to do for the left and right is going to duplicate this rotate up or down, rename it to rotate left or right. And simply just going to change the addition here. Instead of adding on the X, we're going to add on the Y. So just to kind of move this around a little bit, take the Y, add that into the Y here, and take the X and put it there. And just to kind of clean things up a little bit, do something like that. Oh, this. Same thing here. Just left click, double left click on the line to create the reroutes. Select them. If you press Q, it'll straighten them out. And just kind of reroute it like that. So now we can see what's going on a little better. So Y into adding to the Y here. Perfect. Going back to our event graph, we're going to take our two new functions and plug them in here and plug it in here. Plug this in here and plug that in there. Beautiful. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is reset all of our locations, rotations, and detaching of the pivot when this timeline finishes. So to do that, we're going to make a event dispatcher. So going to My Blueprints, Event Dispatcher, and we're going to add, just undock that, and we're going to call it on roll finished. And we're just going to drag it out and call it when it's finished. Like that. That's all we do. Now, in order for this to work, we're going to go back to our cube controller, create a new function called reset all. And we're going to need two variables here. So click that and search for Boolean, which is going to be our can move. And then we're going to add another variable for a vector to hold the position modifier. So that we can reset it in here. So for this to work, we're going to need our cube player. And we want to detach the pivot from the player. So go to our cube and create a new function for detach pivot. Take our pivot, or actually not pivot, sorry, our skeleton mesh, and call detach from component. And we're gonna keep world, keep world, keep world, and do that. Beautiful. Going back to our cube controller, we can call detach what? Oh. Yeah. Oh, I spelled it all weird. Detach. Detach pivot. Perfect. Then we're going to reset the pivot point, pivot world rotation, and finally set the pivot location to our last stored position modifier. And this is going to be coming from, if we go to our event graph, real quick, I'm just going to delete that for a second. We go here, and we have our first movement here. So we have our position modifier right there. What I'm going to do is take our position modifier, set it to that value of -50. Connect it there, and connect it there. And connect this right there. So we have our stored value of our position we're moving in, which in the reset all is going to use it to move the pivot forward in that same direction. Because essentially when you're moving the cube and it rotates, it moves and rotates a little bit forward. So that pivot point, even though it moved forward 50 in the Y, the cube moved forward 50 as well, or moved in the Y as well. So you need to reposition the pivot to be back in the center of the cube in its new rolled location. So it starts in the center, moves here, and then recenters itself where the new cube is, like that, right, when it rolls. So we want to keep recentering it every single time. Control Z. And let's see if I didn't mess everything up here. Yep, all good. 0, 0, perfect. Yep, so that's what we're doing here. Now we can go back to our event graph. And when, where's our begin play? Yep, right here. We're going to bind that event on roll finished to that reset all function. So do that, we're going to drag from our player, go bind event to on roll finished, so that anytime on roll finished gets called, it will call this event. And we do that once at begin play. So from this event, we're going to call create event and drop down and search for our reset all right there. And that's all we need to do for that. Oh, yep. Last thing we need to do here, of course, is call our rotate function. So grab our player, call rotate cube, and the position modifier we're going to input here for our up and down is -90. These are just values that through testing I found that work the best. So we're going to plug that in there and bio and go test that out. So press play and press W. Looks like I did rotate, but in the wrong direction. So I'm going to go look at see what that issue was. Oh, yep, of course, I forgot to select up or down. Super simple. I'm glad it was something super simple. So go back, press play, press up or down. Hey, and there we go. We have our first movement as a cube. Now if I press it again, yep, I will continue to keep moving, but we don't want to be able to spam it like that. So in order to fix that, we're going to control when this happens. So that's why we have our can move. I'm going to get this branch, and by default it should be true because you want to be able to move on begin play. If it's true, we're going to set it to false so that when you press it again, it won't keep moving and you can't spam it. So when it's true, I'm going to set it to false, move this back here. Oh, yep, set it to false and connect that there. Perfect. And we want to reset this when reset happens. So go to reset and call, set our can move back to true. Compile, save, go back to level, press play, and now we can spam W as much as we want, but it'll only roll every 0.5 seconds because that's how long it takes for the timeline to call on roll finished, which calls reset all, giving us our boolean back to true, allowing us to press this again and do all this. Wonderful. Now that we know that the functionality works for up or down, we're going to kind of optimize this a little bit so that we can use this for every single input, and we don't have to keep copy pasting all of this and doing all that. So we're going to make it into one big function. We're going to go select all of this, collapse to function, right click and collapse to function, right click on one of the nodes, and we're going to call this init for initialize cube roll. All right, plug that right there. Go into our init cube roll. And simply, we're going to have a few inputs for this, one being our position modifier. So we can set it from here. It stores it, and then hands it over to our function. The next thing we're going to need is our up or down. And last one is our pivot rotation modifier. Now I can right click and search for up and down, go to the bottom, get this. Yep. And just kind of plug that in there so it's a little bit neater. And same thing with this one. We're doing pivot, rot mod, like that. And beautiful. Now we have our function that does our cube rolling. We'll go back to the event graph and we can see we have those inputs here. So for our up, it's going to be -50. And it's going to be up or down true. Pivot rotation, -90. And go back, compile, save. Test it, make sure everything works still. Yep, beautiful. We can roll around. Go back here to our controller, and we're going to add the other keys. So, beautiful. So we have our up, down, left, and right. Perfect. Now we can copy all this here for this one, here for this one, and here for this one. Plug those all in, plug those in, and plug that in. We're going to change the left and right to be false for up or down. And we're going to start with down. So down, we're going to just change the -50 to 50, positive 50, and the -90 to positive 90. For the right, we're going to actually change it not on the Y, so set that to 0. On the X, we're going to go positive 50. And the pivot rotation is going to still be -90. So that's that. And for left and right, it's going to be the opposite. So it's negative 50 and 90. Like that. And let's go test that out. Let's play. I can go forward. I can go backward. I can go right. I can go left. Oh, left? Uh-oh. Left is doing something. Let's see what left. Negative. Oh, of course. Not on the Y. On the X. Negative 50. My bad. Now everything should be fine. Go left. Yep, we can move left. We can move up, right, down, left, up, right, down, left. We can move. We're a rolling cube now. Yay! If you've gotten this far, pat yourself on the back. Congratulations. You are amazing. Never give up. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.